Have you ever entered a conversation with someone and you just reach a impasse where you realize that you can't talk to each other, that you have fundamentally different worlds, fundamentally different ways of looking at those worlds? Well, Nelson Goodman is here to help in his essay, Words, Works, Worlds. In this essay, we are presented with the crème de la crème of relativism. And it's fantastic to think about this essay because it was published in the journal Erkenntnis, or Knowledge in German, in 1968, the same year that Deleuze and Guattari published Anti-Oedipus. And it is striking how similar what Goodman has to say here is to the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari. He's basically talking about how we need to abandon this notion of some objective world. We need to fully jump into this relativistic, assembled approach to the world that focuses on what he says is the multiplicity of worlds, the speciousness of the given, the creative power of the understanding, and the variety and formative function of symbols. He's going to talk about how instead of thinking about some world, we instead need to think of symbolic systems, and how we cannot talk about meaning or existence independent of those systems, and that's a good thing. Now, Goodman begins by saying that we are not speaking in terms of multiple possible alternatives to a single actual world, but of multiple actual worlds. And this is one of the affirmative parts of Goodman's philosophy, that instead of assuming that all perspectives can be reduced to one world, which is to say that you've got all this multiplicity and only the unitary underlying truthfulness matters. This is kind of the Platonic view, right? Where you have appearance, and beyond appearance, you have truth, which is unmoving and unchanging and doesn't care about your feelings, basically. Well, Goodman says, actually, our feelings and the different viewpoints that we use to construct our world is, in fact, all we have. He says, frames of reference belong less to what is described than to systems of description, and each of the two statements relates what is described to such a system. If I ask about the world, you can offer to tell me how it is under one or more frames of reference. But if I insist that you tell me how it is apart from all frames, what can you say? We are confined to ways of describing whatever is described. Our universe, so to speak, consists of these ways rather than of a world or of worlds. Right? So we're focused on the way that we talk about or construct these worlds. And that's the important part for Goodman, is he's thinking about, okay, if we're not sinking some ground behind all these worlds, what we really should be focused on is how can we change the current worlds, or these systems of reference, how can we change them to be what we would like them to be? Because one of the problems that he sees, and he actually doesn't see this as a problem, I should say, he sees it as just something that is there is a problem of untranslatability. Which is to say that he thinks that, okay, you've got the psychology world over here, and you've got the world of mythology over here, and you've got the world of anthropology and sociology, and all of these are unique frames of reference for talking about things. And as he's just said, I can only talk about these things, whatever they are, the Dingen an sich for Kant, right, the things in themselves, I can only talk about them through these systems of reference. So he says, okay, well, if these different frames of reference are talking about the things in fundamentally different ways, they rely on fundamentally different axioms, then maybe there's just not a way to directly translate from one to the other. Take, for example, I'm here in my room, and I hear a sound out there. Now, let's say I am a religious person, and then I've got another person here who is a physicist. Now, the religious person is going to hear that and have a number of explanations that come to mind. It's a sign from God. It's an angel. It is connects to this Bible verse that I read, whatever it is. Right? You use your hermeneutic to kind of filter in your experience and make it make sense. And you couldn't have sense without that hermeneutic. In the same way, the physicist over here is maybe going to talk about, well, let's make a hypothesis and test it. Or they're going to tell you the frequency of the sounds that is made by that noise. Right? You have very, very different ways of approaching things. And this is why I started off this lecture as I did, because you'll enter situations where you just fundamentally talk about the world differently. I mean, think about someone who's really into like astrology and magic and esotericism versus someone who's like a hardcore rationalistic natural scientist. You just fundamentally approach the world differently. And Goodman's affirmativeness here is not to privilege one over the other. He says there is no right world. There are only different worlds. And within those worlds, there is what he calls a rightness of fit, which is to say some things fit more or less, and certain worlds can be expanded or contracted to help allow more things to fit rightly into that system. But of course, you can't talk about rightness independent of some criterion for rightness, which is only interior to a system. So he says, yeah, doesn't a right version differ from a wrong one just in applying to the world, so that rightness itself depends upon and implies a world? This is the realist approach that's saying, well, you have to be talking about some common world in order to talk about rightness, because you're talking about rightness relative to that world. Well, he says, on the contrary, the world depends upon rightness. And he uses the world here in quotes. So this is a concept, right? This notion of the world. We cannot test a version by comparing it with a world undescribed, undepicted, unperceived, but only by the very means that I shall discuss later. While we may speak of determining what versions are right as learning about the world supposedly being that which all right versions describe, all we learn about the world is contained in right versions of it. Right? In order to actually learn something about the world, there has to be some basic and primordial receptiveness between me and what's going on. It can make some modicum of sense to me. And Goodman says that this is kind of the base level assumption that allows one seemingly different world to actually be absorbed. It's because there's already some similarity, because it's not some ultimately different, fully grounded yet primordial world beyond perspective that is undepicted, unperceived, undescribed. No. It has some commonality to the system you're already using. He says, and while the underlying world, bereft of these, need not be denied to those who love it, it is perhaps whole world well lost. In other words, this notion of the Dingen an sich, of the things in themselves, Goodman says, they don't matter to us anymore. They shouldn't matter to us because we enter these petty squabbles about, I don't know, for example, think of Kant's antinomies in the Critique of Pure Reason, where he's talking about, does the universe have a beginning or not? All this stuff about causality and whatnot, and talking about the limits of reason. And Goodman's basically accepting that, and he's saying, okay, another limit, which Kant recognized this, is the Dingen an sich are beyond us. All we can do is talk about the way in which these worlds become consistent. And this is very reminiscent of the plane of consistency for Deleuze and Guattari, talking about how do things make sense, which is the principal struggle of Deleuze's work, The Logic of Sense. And it's funny, considering I just talked about Deleuze, that Goodman mentions relations that will so sort versions into clusters. And the way he uses clusters in here is exactly how Deleuze and Guattari use assemblages. Maybe not exactly, but it's pretty damn close. And his relativism really comes out when he says, many different world versions are of independent interest and importance without any requirement or presumption of reducibility to a singular base. The pluralist, far from being anti-scientific, accepts the sciences at full value. His typical adversary is the monopolistic materialist or physicalist who maintains that one system, physics, is preeminent and all-inclusive, such that every other version must eventually be reduced to it or rejected as false or meaningless. This is the logical positivists he's referring to here. The logical positivists had this principle of empirical verification, such that if you have a feeling, for example, if it can't be empirically verified, then that feeling is just utterly meaningless for them, because you can't talk. This is kind of the apex of empiricism, right? Totally divorced from any sort of appearance. They want to try to get at the things in themselves through logic, math, and the natural sciences. And for them, meaning is dependent upon empirical verifiability. Now, Goodman is totally disagreeing with this. He's saying, why do we need to reduce things to one base, such as physics? If all right versions could somehow be reduced to one and only one, that one might with some semblance of plausibility be regarded as the only truth about the only world. But the evidence for such reducibility is negligible. And even the claim is nebulous, since physics itself is fragmentary and unstable, and the kind and consequences of reduction envisaged are vague. For how do you reduce Constable's or James Joyce's worldview to physics? That is a great example. How do you take something James Joyce wrote, like Finnegan's Wake, this totally crazy book? How do you take that and reduce that to physics? Well, they're not talking about the same world. I mean, Joyce is concerned with the literary world, what goes on in language and the variety of associations we make within those languages. What does it tell us about desire? I mean, the natural scientists don't care about desire in the same way that a psychoanalyst or a phenomenologist are going to think about desire. They're totally different. The way that you talk about perception or consciousness, I mean, think about the way that Hegel talks about Selbstbewusstsein's self-consciousness versus the way that a cognitive neuroscientist is going to try to talk about consciousness. They're totally different goals, totally different orientations, and Goodman is trying to create a flat ontology. This is a term from Graham Harman that I really like. Instead of having a hierarchized ontology where you have more kind of, I mean, it's the same thing that I was talking about, example, with the notion of a ground, right? Some objective, grounded world, which is what is really true. And then all the images and the semblances and stuff isn't less true, if true at all. That would be a hierarchized ontology. But Graham Harman advocates for a flat ontology, where everything is of equal inherent value, and it can only have relative value. And in the same way, for Goodman, a phenomenon is only going to have value or sense within a frame of reference. And through this frame of reference, it can become more or less important. Maybe self-consciousness is really important for the phenomenologist, for thinking about knowledge. But for someone who has a totally different, I don't know, maybe you're a construction worker, your world just doesn't require you to really think about self-consciousness as the kind of center stone there. And Goodman thinks that's okay. He says, to demand full and sole reducibility to physics or any other one version is to forego nearly all other versions. In other words, we get rid of difference. The pluralist's acceptance of versions other than physics implies no relaxation of rigor, but a recognition that standards different from yet no less exacting than those applied in science are appropriate for appraising what is conveyed in perceptual or pictorial or literary versions. So long as contrasting right versions, not all reducible to one, are countenanced, unity is to be sought not in an ambivalent or neutral something beneath these versions, but in an overall organization embracing them. And this is, we're really getting into the kind of the growth of assemblage theory here, right? We're thinking of a creative, active universe. He talked about the speciousness of the given, the creative power of the understanding, the multiplicity of worlds that interact with each other. And that's the great brilliance of human society, right? Is we have so many different perspectives for talking about the world. And it's just a matter of talking about how did you reach your conclusion so that I can figure out that, okay, even if you're a flat earther, maybe you really aren't trying to be a rational person when you get to this conclusion. And we can talk about the contestation between our two worlds. We can talk about that friction and that difference. That's the kind of stuff that really matters for Goodman. Now, one of the really Heideggerian points that Goodman has is this notion of never being able to get behind the symbolic, never getting behind a symbolic system of reference used to talk about things. He says, okay, talk of unstructured content, or an unconceptualized given, or a substratum without properties. That's self-defeating. For the talk imposes structure, conceptualizes, ascribes properties. Although conception without perception is merely empty, perception without conception is blind, totally inoperative. Predicates, pictures, other labels, schemata survive want of application, but content vanishes without form. We can have words without a world, but no world without words or other symbols. So in other words, the symbolic represents a pre-given logic by which things can cohere together. This is something that you didn't entirely create. For example, why does it make sense that I'm wearing a shirt here instead of no shirt? Well, we have a number of social conventions such that it just makes sense. And you didn't make up those conventions. They already exist. And these serve to give form to the variety of sensory stimuli you're seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, etc. They take all that and turn it into meaningful objects that you can talk about. And you didn't decide that, for example, this shirt is one coherent object instead of a body thing here, and then the sleeve is a separate thing, and this sleeve another separate thing, right? You see it as one coherent object. And this notion of coherence, of structured content instead of unstructured content, of conceptualized givens. In other words, you already have these concepts given to you. This only makes sense if the symbolic is the architecture of the world, and the world is something created from these perspectives and cannot exist independent of them. For to imagine independent of perspective would basically be to imagine it without any of the architecture that allows it to subsist and insist. He says, world-making as we know it always starts from worlds already on hand. The making is a remaking. This is exactly Heidegger's point, right? You already have things which appear to you as ready to hand or not, zur Hand in Hand. And when something is ready to hand, you're allowed to just make use of it and tarry with it. It's something that just naturally is able to be absorbed into your everyday dealings. But when something breaks down, all of his inconspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy from being in time, all of this stuff is going to make it where suddenly it's not ready to hand. There's something wrong with it. The weight's off. The feeling is weird. I can't use it. It's missing, for example, right? This is all the stuff where our world of sense is already there for us. So we already have elements present. Elementary elements, and this is Deleuze and Guattarian language here, that we already have a series of elementary units that we use and that we select from in creating our worlds. This stuff is pre-given. And that brings him into ways of world making. How do we go about constructing these worlds? And funnily enough, he's basically talking about deterritorialization and territorialization or reterritorialization from Deleuze and Guattari in like the same year that they publish Anti-Oedipus. I'm not sure exactly the month that the two were published relative to one another. But he says, okay, there's two things that can be done. One is analyzing complexes into component features, drawing distinctions. And the second is combining features into complexes and making connections. The first one of these is deterritorialization, right? We are drawing distinction. We're taking these complexes and we're picking apart their logic and getting to the base elements where suddenly they lose some of their coding. They still make sense. They're still moving and doing things, but they're specious. They're ready to be used for something. Whereas in the second, this form of territorialization, we make connections. We create complexes out of a variety of elements, and we make it into a scientific theory, for example, or an aesthetic theory, or a work of fiction, right? And he talks about these things like an object or a person, and he says that these things, these are the kind of elementary units that we have. These are formal constructions. Think about the notion of a person. In kind of hyper-colonialist moments, there was a prevalence of race science, which proposed that it was ostensibly using rational scientific means to arrive at the fact that most non-white people are not actually people. That there are some different species, they have different skull structure, or whatever you want to say. This notion of a person was dependent upon the means used to arrive at the notion of personhood in the first place. And the same thing could be said for rationality. What does it mean to be rational? Well, if you look at all the theories of rationality, a lot of them are very Eurocentric. They are based on the cultural presuppositions about what it means to be a rational thinker in the West. And the way that rationality is thought of in different cultures is very different, right? It is very rational for me to wear a shirt as opposed to no shirt. But say you're in an uncontacted tribe that does not have shirts, it would be really weird for them to wear a shirt. I mean, it would almost be an irrational decision. Maybe it would make you more hot or more confined or stick out and become socially ostracized, whatever it is, right? This notion of rightness of fit or of the truth of some sort of category such as objects or persons is not independent of some axiomatic system used to determine who or what that actually is, formally speaking. As such, he says, identity or constancy in a world is identity with respect to what is within that world as organized. Right? So we're referring not beyond the world, but we can only basically refer to our own world and to the elements that have been given to us, and all we can talk about is how do we reorganize them. And that's what Deleuze and Guattari are talking about, is okay, we have this world of pre-given social norms, political ideas, economic ideas, philosophical ideas. How do we talk about renegotiating these? How do we talk about, for example, pure immanence and get rid of transcendence? Well, this requires a willful bastardization of certain concepts that have been given in order to deterritorialize them, to take them away from the dogmatic milieu they were in and open up a new one that has been created out of the kind of piecemeal stuff that already exists. And that's why both Goodman and Deleuze and Guattari are fundamentally creative in their philosophy. As such, he says repetition as well as identification is relative to organization. And this is building on the same point, where a symbolic schema, this is in my notes, must already be at hand in order to determine what can be recognized as same or different, be that in identity or repetition. The symbolic schema itself selects elementary units that are used when we talk about how do we construct a system. Now, the next kind of quality of constructing systems that Goodman talks about is weighting. He says that different things in a system have different weights. They're sorted into relevant or irrelevant kinds. Some differences among worlds are not so much in entities comprised as in emphasis or accent. So, right, different things have different emphases, or what we could say is value or meaning, right? Different things make more or less sense, and this can kind of be seen on a continuum. And as such, he says emphasis or weighting is not always binary, as is a sorting into relevant or irrelevant kinds, or into important or unimportant features. Ratings of relevance, importance, utility, value often yield hierarchies rather than dichotomies, and we might say spectrums rather than dichotomies. Such weightings are also instances of a particular type of ordering, right? We very much impose, for example, when we say that certain people are less human, this orders them in an economic, social, a political system that leaves them vulnerable to structural violence, such as, for example, I'm going to say it again, I've been saying it, but the people in Gaza and Palestine right now, because they have been deemed less viable inhabitants, because they've been deemed, en masse terrorists or whatnot. They've been succumbed to the most terrible punishments. Food and water being restricted, restriction of freedom of movement, murder, all this stuff, right? So all this way of weighting things and ascribing value to them is itself a form of organization. And thinking of Deleuze and Guattari now, organization is making something into the formal object, organ, because this connects to their notion of a body without organs. A body without organs doesn't have these dogmatic organs which only serve one function. Rather, it's a series of flows in which, we kind of try to negotiate those flows without the need to impose this dogmatic notion of organs. And in the same way, Goodman is going to try to talk about, okay, how do we have these constructional systems, which is very similar to regimes of signs in Deleuze and Guattari. How do we come to have these? He says, as nothing is at rest or is in motion apart from a frame of reference, so nothing is primitive or is derivationally prior to anything apart from a constructional system. So there is no prior, there is no ground, there is no behind, and that's totally fine. He says that all of this notion of ordering, this is how we get our elements. He says, for example, rhythms depend upon the marking off into measures. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about it in two ways. Okay, if I snap like this, you don't know if, you don't know what time signature I'm snapping in. This might be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I might be in 6, 8. I might be in 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Right? These are different ways of ascribing a formal quality to the rhythm, which fundamentally changes what it is. And that is the point that Goodman is making. That what it is, this bare snap, is not independent of some schema that I use to talk about it. Whether that be just, for example, the bare fact that I can differentiate one snap from the other. That is itself a conceptual scheme of sorts. It is the way by which I can logically even have this being made sense to me. That's what Goodman is trying to talk about. All measurement, therefore, is based upon order. Indeed, only through suitable arrangements and groupings can we handle vast quantities of material perceptually and cognitively. Right? In order for you to take in this mass cognitive load in front of you, I mean, think about the variety of sensations you're experiencing right now. You have sight, you have hearing, you have touch, you have your taste, which may or may not really be very activated right now. All of this stuff is coming together, and your body has to make sense out of it. And if it was constantly just, oh, here's moment one, and here's the moment a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a second later, and I'm just doing a series of operations one after another on bare sensory stimuli. No, it doesn't really do that. It already has things that it's used to, such that, for example, when your brain recognizes something that you see, it's easier for you to absorb that into your knowledge because it's already given. You will be quicker to run into, for example, functional fixedness, which is the notion that, take this book, for example. I have a number of ways that I use it, and that limits my perception of what this can do because the function it has starts to be fixed because I've used it so many times in that same way. But a child, for example, might use this as like a hammer, or they might try to take a bite out of it. I don't know, a number of different things because they don't yet have that functional fixedness. And Goodman is trying to ask us, how can we try to get rid of that functional fixedness and talk about how we change our systems relative to one another. And one of the things that he talks about, he calls deletion and supplementation. This is the fourth part. And he says, okay, we need to realize that these selection mechanisms that our world versions present us are value contingent. He says that we find what we are prepared to find, what we look for, or what forcibly affronts our expectations, that we are blind to what neither serves nor counters our interests, is a commonplace of everyday life and is simply attested by psychological experiments. In a painful experience of proofreading and the more pleasurable one of watching a skilled magician, we incurably miss something that is there and see something that is not there. Memory edits more ruthlessly. A person with equal command of two languages may remember a learned system of items while forgetting in which language they were learned. And even within what we do perceive and remember, we dismiss as illusory or negligible what cannot be fitted into the architecture of the world we are building. And that's the forward-looking aspect of world building and world making that Goodman wants to look at. That my project for world making is necessarily future-oriented, and I have goals in mind that retroactively determine what it is that I have at my hands now. For example, when I'm thinking of creating the shining new political order of the future, well, if I have certain goals in mind for, like, communism, for example, I will be more quick to focus on things like unions, welfare systems, community organizations, and grassroots organizations. Like, this is the kind of stuff that presents me as the most specious of the elements that I have here. If I'm more of a laissez-faire capitalist, I'm going to be more focused on trading practices, or money and inflation, or the notion of classes, maybe, because maybe I want to maintain classes, or the notion of capital and value, the stock market, right? These are very different kind of elements that I have actively selected and kind of supplemented from the future to the present as what is going to be the most important in my construction of a world. As such, he writes that perception has even greater creative power, because perception itself favors what it is that I'm going to create moving forward. Now, one might hear all this and say, okay, all this relativism is great and all, but what are we actually doing with this? Are we able to reach some notion of truth? Because think about what philosophy has been doing for the majority of its history. You have someone like Plato who sees philosophy as dialectics. We are proceeding via logic, and we're trying to get to truth with a capital T. We're trying to get to the Ding und an sich, the things in themselves. And we're using knowledge to get past the illusory stuff of everyday life, because for Plato, most, if not almost everything in our daily life is completely illusory, mere opinion, and thus not true. We are merely stuck in this illusory state we must get beyond. This is why it is rightly said that The Matrix is a Platonic film. The way it approaches the notion of the real world is exactly the way that Plato talks about it. You've got the world beyond the cave, and our job is to get to that world. And we just need to figure out what's the best way to get there. Well, it's dialectics and logic for Plato. It's going to be the scientific process for the natural scientist. But Goodman's a little concerned about this. He says, insofar as a version is verbal and consists of statements, truth may be relevant. Yeah, it might be important to think about, is this true, what I'm saying? But truth cannot be defined or tested by agreement with the world. For not only do truths differ for different worlds, but the nature of agreement between a version and a world apart from it is notoriously nebulous. Rather, speaking loosely and without trying to answer Pilate's question or Tarski's, a version is true when it offends no unyielding beliefs and none of its own precepts. In other words, our symbolic systems are selfish. The way that they think about truth is what upsets the apple cart the least. And this is something that Deleuze and Guattari are going to take advantage of and say, well, this is the importance of deterritorialization, of creating a body without organs, which fundamentally disrupts the symbolic economy of things as they are currently. So with this notion of truth is something that feels right and makes sense. In other words, it is not some objective thing. It's almost the most subjective, most relative we can get for Goodman. Because to talk about truth requires that we go beyond the nebulousness of talking about my truth relative to some untainted world. Because how could we talk about it without tainting it with our description? Instead, we have to talk about, okay, well, I need to talk about some way of talking about truth within my system. And he says, well, truth, far from being a solemn and severe master, is a docile and obedient servant. In other words, truth is a lot more malleable than we want it to think. I mean, think about media today. Truth is so malleable. Think about the coverage of January 6th as just one example. The scientist who supposes that he is single-handedly and single-mindedly dedicated to the search for truth deceives himself. He is unconcerned with the trivial truths he could grind out endlessly, and he looks to the multifaceted and irregular results of observations for little more than suggestions of overall structures and significant generalizations. He seeks system, simplicity, and scope. And when satisfied on these scores, he tailors truth to fit. I'll say that again. When satisfied on these scores, he tailors truth to fit. He as much decrees as discovers the laws he sets forth, as much designs as discerns the patterns he delineates. And this is one of the fascinating things that Deleuze and Guattari talk about, as well as Foucault, is the fact that the question, Lacan talks about this too, that the question prefers its own answer. It demands to be responded to in a certain way. When I ask you, when are you going to stop cheating on your wife? That question backs you into a corner where you either have to operate on my presupposition that you have been cheating on your wife, or you have to refuse to participate. In the same way, truth is like that. It is necessarily participatory relative to a particular system, and because of that, it is exclusionary and it is conservative. It tries to maintain systematicity, whereby it has a variety of elements it can bring into confluence in a common system. It is simple, insofar as, right, this is Occam's razor. It uses the least assumptions to explain the greatest amount of things, and to do so in a relatively unconvoluted way. And it seeks scope. It seeks to be able to describe a wide domain of elements. This is the goal of any system. I think this is very, very interesting stuff he has to say here. He says, for non-verbal versions, and even for verbal versions without statements, truth is irrelevant. We risk confusion when we speak of pictures or predicates as true of what they depict or apply to, right? Think about Van Gogh's Starry Night, for example. If we think of that as trying to represent the actual sky, that's not what the actual sky looks like, right? It isn't an aesthetic way of constructing a world that has some interesting relationship to our everyday world of looking with our eyes into the sky. Neither one of these is necessarily better than the other, but it would be a mistake to talk about Van Gogh as trying to truthfully describe our world that our eyes look at in the sky. He says, they have no truth value and may represent or denote some things and not others, while a statement does have truth value and is true of everything is of anything. And a non-representational picture, such as Mondrian, says nothing, denotes nothing, pictures nothing, and is neither true nor false, but shows much. And I love this idea of non-representational thinking. We are not trying to represent or denote something. We're trying to cast some experience into the void, right? This is what Lacan says about subjectivity, that I'm trying to prefer a response, which is a recognition of my subjectivity by affectively entering the social sphere. Nevertheless, showing or exemplifying, like denoting, is a referential function, and much the same considerations count for pictures as for concepts or predicates of a theory. Their relevance and their revelations, their force and their fit, in sum, their rightness. And this is that notion of rightness of fit. If I'm in a sculpture world, or a literary world, or a philosophic world, there are certain right ways of talking, for example, and Goodman might be pushing it a little bit, definitely in his kind of analytic sphere that he is in. But there are certain conventions, and there is a rightness of fit relative to that milieu. And the great challenge is to challenge that enough that you upset the apple cart without destroying the apple cart altogether, because you need the apple cart so you can move still. Extending that analogy quite a bit. Rather than speaking of pictures as true or false, we might better speak of theories as right or wrong. For the truth of the laws of a theory is but one special feature. In other words, the laws are a feature of the theory, not of the world they refer to. And as often as we have seen, overridden in importance by the cogency and compactness and comprehensiveness, the informativeness and organizing power of the whole system. In other words, what are our systems trying to do? Well, they're not trying to tell us truth. That's not what knowledge is about. It's about organizing our experience and making sense of it. And that's why Goodman is in this pragmatism reader, because he's a pragmatist in this regard. When we're talking about truth and knowledge, usually we're really just talking about rightness of fit. We're talking about, well, this just doesn't make sense to me. But when I can figure it out and I can say, yes, what I've just said is true, that burden is off my shoulders, because I can compactly talk about this. I can give a cogent explanation, a compact explanation, a comprehensive explanation, an informative explanation which organizes my sensory experience. As such, Goodman writes, reality in a world, like realism in a picture, is largely a matter of habit. And that's very interesting. He says, okay, what I have been saying bears on the nature of knowledge. Of course it does. On these terms, knowing cannot be exclusively or even primarily a matter of determining what is true. As he said, we're not talking about reality as truth, we're talking about habits. We're talking about what feels good, what genuinely makes sense to us. Discovery often amounts, as when I place a piece in a jigsaw puzzle, not to arrival at a proposition for declaration or defense, but to finding a fit. Much of knowing aims at something other than true or any belief. An increase in acuity of insight or in range of comprehension, rather than a change in belief, occurs when we find in a pictured forest a face we already knew was there, or learn to distinguish stylistic differences among works already classified by artist or composer or writer, or study a picture or a concerto or a treatise until we see or hear or grasp features and structures we could not discern before. Such growth in knowledge is not by formation or fixation of belief, but by the advancement of understanding. Right? So really what we're doing is, if you're this member of this uncontacted tribe I mentioned earlier, and you've never seen a shirt before, and I show you a shirt, and I show you the usefulness of it, I show you that now you can distinguish things within my world about, oh, this person running around without a shirt into a store is being impolite, for example. The notion of politeness now makes sense to you because I've explained the function of a shirt. Stuff like this shows a change in my comprehension of this heretofore foreign world, such that I don't necessarily believe something new, but rather I can now understand and make sense of that world. And then I can start talking about beliefs only once I've entered the scene of that world. Furthermore, he writes, if worlds are as much made as found, So also, knowing is as much remaking as reporting. All the processes of world-making I have discussed enter into knowing. Perceiving motion, we have seen, often consists in producing it, right? Preferring that response. Discovering laws involves drafting them. Recognizing patterns is very much a matter of inventing and imposing them. Comprehension and creation go together. So that being said, I hope that this has helped make sense of Goodman, a really interesting pragmatist philosopher. There's lots of other good essays in here if you want to check out this volume. But I find him so interesting for thinking about the theory of Deleuze and Guattari and how there's kind of this odd synchronicity at the same time from the continental and analytic parts of philosophy, respectively. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. You can check out any of the other ones I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because as a poor college student, I'd appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure whatsoever. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.